History will judge us, not by our words, but by our actions. The world is watching. The future is watching. We cannot be the generation that stood by as the world burned, whilst inequality widened and promises of justice went unfulfilled.
This is the journey to one Africa.
I invite His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana, to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, we gather here as members of a global family, not pursuing narrow national interests. The future is not distant. It is here, and the choices we make here will determine the fate of generations to come. Our theme, multilateral solutions for a better tomorrow, reminds us that no nation, however powerful, can resolve today's challenges alone. The climate crisis, inequality, pandemics, terrorism, and violent extremism, these are not local problems. They are global and demand global solutions. We live in an era of division. Too often, we allow lines of wealth, geography, or ideology to define our responses to global challenges. In doing so, we forget that standing apart leads to failure, while standing together ensures progress. The pandemic showed us how interconnected we are. It revealed that no nation can shield itself from a world in disarray. Yet, in its aftermath, we have seen irrational isolationism and blind nationalism resurge. This, my friends, is a path that leads to failure. We must return to the founding principles of the United Nations: cooperation, solidarity, and shared commitment to peace, which underline the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, whose fulfillment presents humanity with its most progressive charter. At the heart of today's crisis is the climate emergency, which threatens humanity's very existence. Africa, whilst contributing the least to global emissions, bears the heaviest burden. From floods to desertification, we're already experiencing its devastating effects. Despite the promises, the vulnerable remain abandoned. We're told to adapt and be resilient. But how does one adapt to famine or build resilience when farmers cannot predict the seasons? Africa cannot continue to pay for a crisis she did not create. We demand fairness, not charity. Climate justice requires an economic system that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. Mr. President, the vast gulf between rich and poor should be a stain on our collective conscience. Over 700 million people, that is 8.57% of the world's population, still live in extreme poverty, deprived of basic human rights: education, food, healthcare, housing, and the dignity of work. The pandemic exacerbated this equality, pushing millions more into poverty, whilst the wealth of the richest soared. This is unsustainable, and it is immoral. We must build a new global economic order, one that promotes inclusivity and equity for all. The multilateral system, especially the United Nations, should be at the forefront of this effort. This leads me to a critical issue: the reform of the United Nations Security Council, the body charged with the maintenance of international peace and security. In its current form, the Council does not reflect the realities of today's world. It remains an outdated post-Second World War relic, with Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, grossly underrepresented. We cannot speak of multilateralism when the structures of global governance are rooted in an unjust and unequal order. Mr. President, the time for half measures is over. Bold reforms are needed to ensure that every nation, large or small, rich or poor, has an equal voice at the table. Only then can we achieve a fair and inclusive system of governance. History will judge us, not by our words, but by our actions. The world is watching. The future is watching. We cannot be the generation that stood by as the world burned, whilst inequality widened and promises of justice went unfulfilled. That is why Ghana supports fully the Global Pact of the future and its supporting documents. I thank you for your attention.
I invite His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, President of the Republic of South Africa, to address the Assembly.
Thank you for this moment, President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, Heads of State and Government, and Excellencies. Let me start off by congratulating Namibia and Germany for the excellent work they have done in guiding us all to this moment on reaching consensus on the Pact of the future. We meet, President, at a time when the world faces many challenges and threats as well. Wars, conflict, and the specter of emerging conflicts are ever persistent and present features of our time. Climate change and public health challenges are not only an existential threat, but they are also reversing economic growth and developmental gains in many parts of the world. There is widespread inequality, poverty, unemployment, deprivation, and destitution in many countries in the world. These challenges transcend borders. Through this summit of the future, we must therefore forge global consensus on how to implement the solutions that are embedded in the Pact. This Pact must bridge the developmental divide. It must provide practical solutions to the challenges of today and tomorrow. The Pact for the Future is a great opportunity to change and also to reinvigorate the multilateral system so that it is fit for purpose to address the challenges that the world faces. It is an opportunity also to make good on the promises to reform the global governance architecture, including the international finance institutions and the United Nations Security Council, placing the fate of the world's security in the hands of a select few when it is the vast majority of the peoples of the world who bear the brunt of the various threats is unjust, unfair, and unsustainable. We agree with the UN Secretary General that the Summit of the Future is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to forge global consensus and make progress on priorities such as sustainable development goals. For African countries, the summit must focus on global action in support of the continent's development agenda, Agenda 2063. To be meaningful, this Summit of the Future should reinforce the work towards ending poverty and realizing the fundamental right of development. This summit, therefore, must accelerate our collective efforts to advance development. The key element of the summit is working towards an agenda for peace, and this must involve strengthening the multilateral actions that need to continue taking place. We do believe that this is the time to recommit ourselves to adopting concrete actions, so we should leave this summit with a more ambitious, clearer and concrete call to action to build a world for future generation that is far better for young people and for women than the world that we live in today. Our failure will in the end be a betrayal for future generations. And I do believe that we dare not fail. Action is what is required now. Thank you very much.